This video is sponsored by Cygames. Hi there, my name is Ignideus, I'm a Shadowverse YouTuber, and welcome to the Shadowverse Beginner's Guide, a series of videos for people who are just getting into Shadowverse. In this video, we'll be covering the basics of deck building. The first thing you want to do when you build a deck is identify what type of deck you want to build and your win condition. These will define how you want your curve to be. The curve is a term that describes how many cards you have in the early, mid, and late game. For example, a low curve deck has a lot of early game, while a high curve deck has a lot of late game. Depending on what kind of deck you want to build, it's important to include the appropriate amount of early, mid, and late game to best achieve your game plan. Regarding the type of deck, there are a few important archetypes that you should familiarize yourself with. Namely, aggro, mid-range, control, and combo. Aggro is short for aggressive, focusing on bringing down the opponent's defense as fast as possible, usually by going face. That is, damaging the enemy leader directly. It's characterized by a lower curve. Mid-range emphasizes threat in the mid-game, less aggressive but more flexible than aggro, and still aiming to end games before the late game comes in. Aggro and mid-range decks generally focus on victory through tempo, meaning establishing a high pace of threats each turn and overpowering the opponent. Often you have to sacrifice card advantage, which is the amount of cards that you have in hand compared to your opponent, for tempo, which is something to keep in mind when building decks in this style. So don't include cards that are too greedy, meaning low tempo but high value. Control decks, on the other hand, tend to focus on value over tempo. Characterized by a high curve, it's all about getting the most out of each of your cards, playing defensively, controlling the board via clearing the enemy's threats, and preserving your own. All to drag the game to the late game to win either via attrition or some big finisher. Combo decks focus on specific card synergies that work together to end the opponent in very few turns. Often, combo decks employ controlling strategies so that they can survive long enough to assemble all the pieces they need for their combo, but this isn't always the case. There are combo decks that can hybridize with more tempo-based strategies. Regarding win conditions, it's important to identify what yours is. That is, how are you going to win the game? Through sheer tempo, attrition, a specific bombastic combo turn? What cards specifically are you going to use to achieve this? Once you identify what cards you're going to use to win, it becomes much easier to build the deck around it. Let's take a look at the deck building process through an example. Say I want to build a combo deck in rotation based around the Runecraft card, Giant Chimera. Once you know how you want to win, add those cards. So add a few copies of Giant Chimera to the deck. Activating the effect of Giant Chimera more than once seems helpful. So let's add in Loki, which makes the next fanfare that I play trigger twice. From there you can flesh the deck out. Add cards that support that win condition. Giant Chimera wins with massive damage boosted by spells, so I'll add plenty of spells to the deck, especially cheaper ones that'll help me spell boost. Since I'm spell boosting for the Giant Chimera plan anyway, I think it'd be good to add more spell boost followers that also benefit from the spell synergy. So I'm gonna add some regular sized chimeras as well. Now, I'm going for a more control style of combo deck, so that I can have more time to assemble the pieces that I need for my combo. So I'll need some removal cards to deal with my opponent's threats. Wind Blast seems like a good pick for this. It's spell boosts, it's cheap, so it spell boosts my other stuff as well, and it also removes enemy threats. Next, I'll add some card draw, since I need to draw my Giant Chimera as fast as possible to make the game plan work. Drawing more cards also helps me not to rely as much on top decks, meaning the card that you just draw from the top of your deck at the beginning of each turn. So I'm going to add Chain of Calling to the deck, because it puts a random Runecraft follower from the deck into my hand, meaning they can fetch my Giant Chimera. Depending on the archetype that you're going for, make sure that you have a good curve to ensure that you have cards to play in the early and mid game, as well as late game if you're planning on a slower game plan. It's always a good idea to look at the curve at the top of the screen when building a deck. Try not to make it too wonky one way or the other unless you know what you're doing. It's especially important in Shadowverse to have enough early game so that you don't brick, which means not being able to play any cards. Because if you brick in the early game, the opponent can often run you over. In that same vein, think about what your mulligan strategy for the deck will be while building it. The mulligan is the stage before the game starts where you can redraw the cards that you don't want in your opening hand. You generally want to keep some early game, or a good curve, which in this context means keeping a hand that allows you to play cards that maximize your play point usage each turn, or very important pieces to your game plan. So let's add a bit more early and mid game so that we can survive to the later turns, and have some low cost cards that we can try to mulligan for. As an aside, when you're building a deck, you might find that you don't have the cards that you want to put in the deck in your collection. The game is generous in rewarding you with more card packs and rupees, but you can also liquefy other cards for vials. The benefit is that by using the vials that you get, you can acquire the cards that you actually need for the deck that you want to build, but it can be tough deciding which cards to liquefy because you might regret it later if it ends up being something that you want in the future. So to that end, I always advocate trying a card out before liquefying it if you're at all unsure. When you're finished with your first draft of the deck is when the most important part comes. Test the deck. Note what worked and what didn't. Which cards underperform? Which cards do you need more of? Do you need more card draw or more board presence? Iterate the deck. Iterate it again and again and again until finally you're happy with how the deck performs.
You're strong.
An important thing to note is that as you're in the process of refining a new deck, you should be expecting to lose, so it's a good idea to bring it into unranked mode first, before you're confident enough to bring it into ranked mode and putting your ladder score on the line for it. Another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes a deck idea just doesn't work, no matter how much you tinker with it. It's up to you to decide when to give up on the idea, but if you're facing overwhelming loss after overwhelming loss, it might be better to just let it go and pick up another idea. That's the basics of deck building, but on a slightly more advanced note, I want to touch on the importance of building your deck for the meta. The meta, short for metagame, is the state of popularity and power of decks. Basically, what everyone else is playing. No deck exists in a vacuum, so depending on the meta, you'll have to adjust your deck to maximize its effectiveness. You could also just play the meta decks since they're proven to work and they're good, but if you're like me and you enjoy challenging the meta with new or unpopular decks that can surprise your opponent for wins, then you need to know how to tech. Teching your deck means to include cards to specifically counter a certain deck or strategy in the meta, and tech cards are usually not regarded as something that's standard in the deck, so having that unexpected answer might catch your opponent off guard. For example, if the meta involves a lot of wide boards of small followers, then I might want to include Nova Flare. Or if the meta involves big individual threats that are immune to damage from spells and effects like Beauty and the Beast, then I can tech in a card that transforms followers like Fall from Grace, so that I can deal with it. One of the keys to good deck building is to include cards that advance your own game plan, but also have answers to the meta. Even meta decks can tech against other meta decks to gain an advantage over them. In fact, the entire metagame can shift if techs get popular enough to drive a meta deck out. Then there's a new meta to answer. And that dynamism is what makes deck building, and the game in general, so fun. And that's it for this video on deck building. I hope it was helpful. Next up on the Shadowverse Beginner's Guide, an introduction to Dragoncraft. Like the video if you did, subscribe for more Shadowverse content, and stay tuned for more guides like this one. Bye-bye.